Hello, today I am presenting on evaluator bias at choral festivals. So why is evaluator bias a critical issue? Many choral programs rely on the scores and feedback from the festivals to prove value to administrators. We all know that we have to advocate for our programs, and especially when administrators are not music people or music educated, we have to have some way to advocate for our programs and show value for our programs. And a lot of time the scores and the rankings from these festivals are what we use to advocate for our program as secondary reasons for why we have these programs. Many choral programs expect equitable and valid evaluations. I'll be so bold to say every choral program expects an equitable and valid evaluation from experienced and trained evaluators. Choral programs are diverse entities, and evaluators must be knowledgeable about different types of good choral singing. There is not one type of choral singing that is best, and there's not one type of choral singing that is true. There's many different types, and they come from all different backgrounds, and an evaluator needs to be knowledgeable about these different diversities and these different types of singings. An evaluator bias can result in frustration amongst directors. It can result in frustrations towards the festival themselves. And it can just make, it can really upset the positive attitude that should be held at these festivals. Bias can be presented in two ways. We have non-musical factors as well as musical factors. And I will go through each one of these throughout the presentation. The non-musical factors are performance order, student appearance, and evaluator fatigue. And those come from an article called Assessing Music Performance Issues and Influences by Gary McPherson and William Thompson. And then we have musical factors that were gathered from the Mississippi State Choral Assessment Rubric. And those are personal preferences, descriptor biases, and weighted categories. So non-musical factors is performance order. What we need to consider is which order the student or choir performs at the evaluation. It seems evident that larger ensembles with good reputations or who have won in the past or who've been ranked highly in the past, they are placed at the end of the competition or the festival to save the best for last, have that mentality. Unfortunately, the choir's placement is usually out of the control of the director. Research suggests that choirs that perform at the end of the day end up receiving higher scores. And as I mentioned before, directors simply do not have a say in this matter. Just because a group is positioned to perform at the end of the day does not inherently mean that they are better than groups that performed earlier in the day. And this performance order can create a large area for bias. Another non-musical factor is student appearance. How the student feels about himself or how they appear to feel about themselves or about their performance can really affect their scores. And this presents a bias considering that their appearance is not necessarily something that should be judged so critically when we're really listening for their choral singing. Things like confidence, visible interest or effort, stage presence, personality, dress, and appearance. These aren't necessarily equitable in that there's a lot of factors that go into why students look the way they do and why they behave the way they do. We have mental stress, mental anxiety. There's a lot of factors like that as far as confidence and stage presence and personality. And then we also have socioeconomic differences with dress and appearance. Students that do not have the ability to afford crisp tucks, the whole 9 yards outfit should not be judged differently. The way they look and the way that they present themselves, while it is important that they feel good about themselves and that as a director, they have made them feel good about themselves, that really isn't something that we should be evaluating at this point, considering we do not know these children or students. Another non-musical factor is evaluator fatigue. When competitions or festivals allow or invite too many participants, the burden on the evaluator can cause mental and physical fatigue. This fatigue can result in a bias with the ratings. There's long hours. Evaluators can begin to judge easier or harder as the day progresses based on their fatigue. It can affect their mood. It can affect their ability to effectively and equitably judge a performance, if that is a word. The Mississippi, this is a rubric that I'm going to be using for the second half of this presentation. The Mississippi Music State Performance Assessment Performance Adjudication Rubric. It's a big word, I know. It's from the Mississippi Music Educators Association in conjunction with the MHSAA, which is the Mississippi High School Association for activities as well. As you can see right here, now that I have shared my screen, here it is. This is the rubric that's used for choral festivals. Some different things I want to point out before we continue the presentation. There's different areas that an evaluator uses to judge. They have the overall score, and then you can see each subcategory scoring. And then you can also see that there's descriptors within each subcategory. So that goes on to our musical factors. So with the personal preference, if you were looking at that rubric, things like the main categories were sound quality, technical accuracy, musicality, and stage deportment. And those can definitely present their own personal biases or personal preferences that create a bias, because most evaluators really are educators or musicians that have had a lot of experience in the field, and those experiences lead to personal preferences for how they would lead a choir or you know, how they would themselves sing. So those personal preferences end up being the main tool we use to judge. So this is something that we need to consider, that in each one of these categories, that our personal preference does not take over from how the students are executing what has been asked of them by their own director. So this goes on to our descriptor bias. So the first category is sound quality, and then you have two subcategories, tone quality and pitch. You can see that the sound quality is 30 points, and then it's divided 15 for each subcategory. The descriptors are natural for this age, free of tension, control, and vibrant, has energy, and for pitch, it's accuracy and intonation. For the personal preferences of how a choir sounds natural or free or vibrant can easily thwart the validity of the evaluation. Who assigned these descriptors to good choral singing? You know, one evaluator's descriptor in their own personal mind for what sounds natural and what sounds free and what sounds vibrant can be very different from another. So this is where personal preference bias comes into play. As far as accuracy and intonation, that's something that can pretty much be evaluated with your experience. The rubric goes on to assign 30 points for technical accuracy. You can read here that it has attacks, accents, releases, tempo, pronunciation, and so on and so forth. While attacks, accents, and releases can be accurately evaluated, the challenge of the music for the choir, as you can see under technique, can be a subjective area. There's no definitive answer to what an appropriate level of a challenge is when you don't have prior knowledge of where this choir has come from. The second subcategory is rhythm. Rhythmic accuracy can be evaluated with validity, but concessions must be made for artistic interpretation for the tempos and the pulse. Again, personal preference can reveal bias in this area. And then with diction, instead of considering how an evaluator prefers diction or how they would instruct their choir, the evaluator must consider whether the singers are executing the diction in the same fashion or not. whether the students are executing correctly or whether you just didn't like what the director chose. Those are two completely different things. And the evaluator must keep that at the forefront of their mind, that their preference is not what they're evaluating. The next one is, this is descriptor bias continued. Musicality. Now, this is the most heavily weighted category, where you see technique has 15 points, dynamics 10, breath management 10, and you can see all the descriptors here. So under technique, most of these descriptors are, quite frankly, open to interpretation and can be highly subjective. I mean, we have correct style application, balance, artistry, sense of ensemble, communicating with a sense of purpose, appropriate repertoire, expressivity, and nuances. For instance, honestly, some of these descriptors used in this subcategory could seem irrelevant to the subcategory technique. For instance, it could be questioned why descriptors like sense of ensemble or appropriate repertoire falls into the technique category. Also, these descriptors, how can these descriptors be assessed in a valid manner? How does one appropriately assess a performance's ability to communicate with a sense of purpose? Bias can honestly arise from the confusion that these descriptors can cause. Then we go on to dynamics. Personal preferences should not interfere with the assessment of a performance. Again, directors can be conservative or dramatic with dynamic instruction. It is imperative that an evaluator judges the singer's execution of dynamics instead of the director's artistic decisions on dynamics. As you can see, a lot of these kind of have the same bias. And then finally, breath management, that seems to be a relatively objective category and can be assessed based on those descriptors. Stage deportment is another one that can create a lot of bias. When comparing the descriptors in this category with the descriptors in the musicality category, specifically under technique, there seems to be some redundancy issues. Communicating with a sense of purpose, expressivity, and sense of ensemble could arguably be included in the stage deportment category. So there's just some different things. And this goes on to my next point, the weighted categories. What one director finds should have more points, or what they find should have less points, can definitely create a bias. So for instance, if stage deportment in your mind should receive more points, then you might lower points and other points to kind of weigh it on your own. And if an evaluator does that, then there's some bias that could create that way, but also there's just bias within the rubric itself, because someone has decided in a somewhat biased manner which categories deserve more points. So a director who instructs their group on a lot more technical accuracy might lose points under musicality and stage deportment, where, or sound quality might be the most important category to a director, but it doesn't even receive the most points. So, there's a bias within the rubric itself. So how do we overcome these biases? It is important for music educators to explore possible solutions to the issue of evaluator bias at choral festivals. One possible solution to prevent bias is to require all educators to complete this course right here, the National Federation of State High School Associations Music Adjudication course. It can be found at nfhs.org. And if you're an educator, it is a free course. It is updated every year. We had to take it if you were in this cohort in our evaluating music class. And it is something that really enlightens you to potential biases. The training course outlines the role of the adjudicator, trains evaluators in the best practices to avoid biases and different things like that. Then another solution to overcome this bias is professional development. This can be formal or informal, and the purpose of professional development is to give the evaluator the opportunity to explore many types of singing practices and to become knowledgeable enough to appropriately and validly evaluate performances. So again, this professional development, whether formal or informal, should give the evaluator the opportunity to explore different types of choral singing and to become knowledgeable enough to overcome personal preferences. And finally, just basic awareness. If you have an awareness of how biases are created, there's greater opportunity for you to avoid them. One's own personal experiences with choral performances will not suffice when evaluating choirs from different places, cultures, or from different choral philosophies. Awareness of how these biases towards these different types of philosophies or different types of places or cultures, awareness of how these biases are created is super important. It's unbelievably important. Evaluators need to be aware of non-musical as well as musical biases that can develop and disrupt an evaluation process. I mean, it should be the goal of all evaluators, whether you're an evaluator or whether you're a director, it should be the goal of being in a choral festival or evaluating to judge choral performances with equity, fairness, and validity. Thank you.